Hey, good afternoon. I'm Robert Mounts, the president of the museum, wearing my Itchy Tony Alliance hat today in honor of the speaker in this great program that we have. And because as a boy growing up in Gainesville, like probably many of you, I took about 40 camping trips with the Boy Scouts, starting at the head of the Itchitonia River. And then instead of inner tubes floating down the river, we'd float on our air mattresses. And that was kind of sissy too. You mean you brought air mattresses on a camping trip? Yes, we did. But it was quite an experience growing up and my introduction to the Florida waterways. Vasilios Kosmakos today is the founder of the Florida Naturalist Oral History Project and coordinator of the History of Water Management Project at the University of Florida's Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. That's Paul Ortiz and company, one of our advisory council members. He's going to discuss the interconnectivity of Florida's waterways all the way from the aquifer to the Keys. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I learned a couple of interesting things about him while talking before the program. He's just now graduating from the University of Florida. Some people say he's really young, but look at what he's doing and look what he's going to provide you today. He's going into the Peace Corps for 2 years in Paraguay, and then he's going to seek his PhD. So he's got an expertise in environmental issues, and his program today is very well attended. And I do have an obligatory statement I have to read. This program is sponsored in part by Visit Gainesville, Alachua County, the City of Gainesville, and the Department of State, Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of the Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. Why? Because the Mathis Museum lives on grants, membership dues, donations, and grants. We're not part of the city, county, or the state. We're a private nonprofit museum with a mission to interpret the history of Alachua County and surrounding area. And if you like what we're doing here, please see Will It back there and sign up to become a member. For only $25, $30, you and your family can be a member, get regular notices about our programs, get our newsletter and all of that, and discounts at the store out there. So this is not a book signing today, but it's going to be a great program. And now I would like to introduce Vasily Kosmakos.
Hello, and thank you for such a wonderful introduction. My name is Vasilios Kosmakos, founder of the Florida Naturalist Oral History Project, and I'm welcoming you today to Interwoven Waters, exploring Florida's interconnected waterways. Thank you for being here. So first and foremost, this exhibit is an extension of the Florida Naturalist Oral History Project. As you can see by this map here, from the Panhandle all the way to the Keys, the Florida Naturalist Project has conducted over 60 oral history testimonies with a variety of stakeholders, ranging from everyday individuals, artists, policymakers, scientists, business owners, indigenous people, fishermen, and policymakers. Because I believe that we need to re we need to figure out how we're communicating science more effectively. A scientist might be able to provide, a more technical analysis of red tide, but how is that affecting the fisherman? A fisherman is dealing with that resource every single day. He knows those fish better than themselves, and just because he doesn't have a PhD or degree does not mean his perspective is worth any less. How is that affecting individuals? How is that affecting people like me or you on their day-to-day lives? These are questions we have to answer, and these are perspectives that we have to take seriously because everything we do to save the environment will is gonna be the result of a collective effort that all of us do together. So here's an example of some of the people I've spoken to. I've spoken to some of Florida's top scientists, like Dr. Robert Knight, who some of you may be familiar with. I've spoken to scientists at Motor Marine Laboratory. I was the first person in over 50 years at the Summer Proctor Oral History Program to speak to a member of the Seminole tribe, we see on the bottom right. I've spoken to business owners like Tim Schwartzman and politicians like Robert Blackman and other scientists like Dr. Thomas Wilmore. So I've had this rather eclectic, array of different perspectives, and through this, I've gotten to some really profound, ideas of how we need to evaluate Florida's waterways. So first and foremost, before we broke things apart, we as humans understood how important interconnectivity was. Before we broke things into biology, chemistry, history, geology, or art, we understood that all these subjects interconnected with one another, and that's what made our species go forward. Our species is on the top of the food chain. We are successful not because we understand how to separate things, but because we understand how things are interconnected. As you can see here, you know, as you can see here, the same patterns in nature reflect each other over and over and over again. These patterns are reflected into in our biology, our psyche, our political and social systems. So to think of of the world around you as anything else other than this magnificent collection of of interconnections in of is 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 a bit interesting. So and here's a map of waterways across the entire country. Every single line you see here, right, is a river or a creek. As you can see between these two images, it looks exactly the same. It looks exactly the same, for a reason. In just the same way that a good doctor understands how our lungs and our heart systems are connected, right? We need to apply the same level of thinking to our waterways because whatever we do at the top is going to affect what we do at the bottom. We have hold on we have huge environmental disasters like what happened recently in Palestine, Pennsylvania, right? Those radiation levels, everything you put in those waterways is going to, goes down into this vast network and it ends up into our Gulf of Mexico, right? It ends up in our, it affects people tens of thousands of miles away. It affects communities who don't know each other. So understanding how these systems are interconnected, not, pro- provides a foundation, is just so important. So to begin with, I want to discuss the aquifer. So the aquifer is a vast underground body of water underneath your feet. It's probably about 20 feet underneath us right now, right? The Florida aquifer is one of the most productive aquifers in the entire world. It holds over 100 trillion gallons of water and provides every drop of drinking water you put into your body. Looking at a bottle of water next to you, open the faucet. More than likely, that water is coming from the aquifer. Right. So that and that's and that's where the story of our water starts. So again, it's the largest aquifer in the southeast. It extends all the way into South Carolina, into parts of Alabama, and goes all the way down to the bottom of the state. Over 90% of Floridians rely on aquifer for their drinking water. And as you can see through these blue dots on this graph here, those are our springs. And the aquifer, just like again, our river systems, just like our veins, just like cells on leaves in the plant, is a vast, is interconnected in a vast underground, is in a vast underground river. You know, we think that we think that our water is so much older than we give it credit for, right? That our that some scientists mention that our water is between 11,000 is between 11,000 years old. I mean, it's a lot more, and I don't think we give enough credit to the fact that that this is a living, breathing system that just so happens to be made out of rock, right? It's like when you have things, when you have these systems, right? Whatever the community does here, whatever happens here, whatever when water from through rainfall leaches in this area, it goes directly into that system, and that's what you're drinking. Right. So understanding how, so understanding this vast, now, labyrinth of passages, and thinking of it as a underground river instead of just, a storage container of water really helps us understand how these systems are interconnected. And here's a beautiful picture of the aquifer provided by John Moran. The aquifer, again has small crevice is composed of a series of small holes the size of small crevices or as large as some of the largest caves in the world. Again, oil water is flowing through these passages and afterward springs forth through the Florida Springs, and that's how it ends up on the surface. This is a beautiful picture provided again by John Moran that shows just how wonderful the springs are. Again, the water from the aquifer springs up through the ground and into our springs, but through human ignorance and through our, and through and through our ability and through our effect on these waterways, we're having an incredible impact. Springs degradation is complicated. A lot of people attribute it to nitrates, and nitrogen as a result of things like fertilizers off our lawns, as a result of, agriculture, or as a result of, septic tanks, right? But it's a really complicated issue. Other people think that spring degradation is also a result of lack of dissolved oxygen. So plants need things to grow, right? Anybody that gardens can understand that they need sunlight, water, nutrients. Well, plants underwater work the same exact way, right? So, there's plenty of water because it's Florida spring, right? But the two different variables that might be kind of influenced are sunlight and nutrients. When you put an excessive amount of nutrients into our waterways, just like when you just like, for example, when you over fertilize your lawn, right? Fertilizer causes plants to grow. They take advantage of these nutrients and use them up. Well, in the same way that if I would just take all the oxygen out of the room, right, and everybody here would suffocate, when there's too much algae, when there's too many nutrients, right, it causes an excessive amount of algae to grow. This algae takes all the oxygen out of the water and suffocates us. Just in the same vein as if I would take all the oxygen out of this room. Or again, the other factor is dissolved oxygen. So plants produce oxygen, right? They produce oxygen, and we expel carbon dioxide. Well, plants, right? When there's a lack of sunlight, right? They aren't able to produce as much oxygen, so the amount of oxygen goes down. And again, that pretty much suffocates the plants and animals in our springs. The amount of herbivores, right, the snails that keep algae down, right, or the Plecostomus or other fish, right, go down, and suffocate as a result of their not being enough oxygen. So, I mean, even though there's a rather profound disagreement between what exactly causes it, it's probably a combination of those two things. And here's some examples of what exactly is happening to our springs. So, I mean, again, you're just seeing this, gross degradation that we're seeing. We have crystal clear blue waters, and now they're turning into green slush. I mean, and that's a direct result of us through our inability to understand that what we do on the surface ultimately affects our waterways and vice versa. I mean, like, I mean, you have this crystal clear blue water, and then you have these two pictures of mullets. They're swimming through this crowd, this gnarly, cloud green algae, and that's what we're doing here. And just to kind of show how our spring systems are affected, are interconnected, here's an example of the Swanee River Basin. Every single spring in this map, as you can see, every dot on this map is a spring. Well, what happens and there's a lot of talk about saving Ginny Springs or saving, Rainbow River, or advice, pick a spring, there's a campaign to save it. Well, I mean, understanding how every spring relates to each other, allows us to tackle these issues a lot more comprehensively. Because if you save this spring, right, there's no, you know, by saving the spring downstream, if the spring upstream is having an issue, then you're not solving the issue effectively. And the thing about this, right, is that every single ounce, and when we pollute our springs, okay, they eventually flow into our river systems, and every single thing we put into our river systems ultimately flows onto the Gulf of Mexico. Right, by not treating things at the source, by not treating our water systems holistically, we are, we are wasting our time, we're wasting our money, we're wasting our energy, and we're hurting the people along these systems, in the ways that we can't even imagine. And here's an example, and this is a clip of one of the interviews I conducted by Merle Gibson, who's one of the foremost springs activists in Florida, about just kind of explain kind of what I just told you.
How we use our water at our property, whether it's a business or residence or whatever that looks like on the surface, we're connected to it. We're connected by our land use. And it shows up in our waterways. It shows up in the studies. It shows up in dye trace studies that some of the scientists have done. So is that...
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. When you see a dye trace study, for instance, at I-75, they did dye trace studies when the community was fighting the Walmart that was supposed to go in behind the McDonald's, roughly near the Sunnies at I-75, the exit 399. They did some dye trace studies and some sinkholes that were in that vicinity, And that showed up 14 days later at Hornsby Springs.
So again, our water is a lot newer than I think we give it credit for, right? When we put something in the spring, upstream, it's going to have these downstream effects. You know, um, and not tackling these issues that way is fairly insane. So up from our springs, right, and down to our coastal estuaries. So I just mentioned that the water from our springs goes into river systems, you know, and this is an example of Tampa Bay, right? One of our the largest estuary in Florida. Tampa Bay is home to over 300 different species of of birds, and again is an incredibly important source of filtration and of storm erosion. I'm sorry, in preventing storm erosion in Tampa region. And as you can see here, every single one of these waterways flows into Tampa Bay. You know, the two the Alfea and the Hillsborough River, which are here and here respectively, are the two biggest sources of sediment. I'm sorry, the two biggest sources of discharge in Tampa Bay. Well, what's happening? Because we're so focused on what we're doing along the coast, and we're not putting enough emphasis on what's happening on the stuff upstream. We're having things like lead and mercury and and nitrates that are causing historic red tide blooms. I live in Tampa Bay, and I mean just recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had this horrible red tide bloom. And and I couldn't walk outside. I was coughing and sneezing. I mean, I couldn't walk around I couldn't walk around my neighborhood because of the decisions we're doing on the surface. And as a result of that, we're having historical degradation. Tampa Bay is a world case study and in seagrass restoration. People from around the world look at Tampa Bay as an example to understand what we can do to take an ecosystem and bring it back on the verge of extinction. Because during the 60s and 70s, right, we weren't doing what we were supposed to, and that led to a horrible decline. Well, I mean, what Tampa Bay is showing now is that now the what Tampa Bay is showing now is that it's showing that these aren't issues that you can fix and leave. Since over the last 5 years, we've seen a 12% decrease in our seagrasses. We've had our seagrasses, which provide food and shelter to hundreds of different animals, of manatees, of crabs, of fish, of our provide the foundation for entire ecosystems, are getting destroyed, are getting completely obliterated. And again, you know, we're going, and again, we went from a world-renowned example of recovery to slipping down to losing 12% of our seagrasses in 5 years. I mean, that's hundreds of acres that we're losing because we're keeping our eye off the prize. We have to remain vigilant and we have to remain on top of whatever we're doing, because these issues, as easy as they can be fixed, can just as easily, get destroyed. And here's a clip that kind of shows how important our seagrasses are.
And now, since we have no bottom, when the wind blows, we have more wave action, and we have the Dust Bowl of the 1930s happening underwater for us right now. If you have no bottom, you have no grass, it doesn't hold the sediment and with sand and mud and what have you down there. So now when the grass is gone, the current comes in, we have big wave action, it just rolls the bottom. And you can see the rolls of mud out there. And it washes away basically the topsoil. And if the topsoil is gone, then the new grass cannot root or do anything because it doesn't have the bottom for it.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It's the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Again, the farmers lost all their fields. They had nothing to plant into. It was down to rock. So it's...
Wow.
Land and water work the same way. It's the exact same thing. Just one's under one median, we're above it. That's all it is.
Again, our systems are reflected over and over and over with each other. What happens on land affects what happens in our oceans. What happens in our own bodies reflects what's happening on outside the surface. Because of the plastic pollution that we're putting out into the environment, we're starting to see microplastics in our own cells. Right, whatever we do to the environment, eventually, almost always comes back and bites us in the butt. Because again, these systems reflect whatever happens on the surface, happens on the bottom, as above, so below. And Tampa Bay is home. Tampa Bay is is the number one rated beach in the entire country, the number one rated, the fifth best rated beach in the entire world, and we're seeing it destroyed, right? Again, through things like red tide events, which are which are created by an algae called Carina brevis. It's called red tide because it produces a red algae, in the ocean, and in the same way that algae suffocates and destroys things in the springs, the same exact thing happens in the ocean, but just through a different algae, and again called red tide. And again, we're seeing this destruction of our environment. You have these beautiful beaches that are getting turned into garbage piles because of what we're doing. you know so on from our coastal so on from our rivers, and creeks, now to our and now to Central Florida. Swamps and our wetlands are some of the most important ecosystems on the planet, right? Think of them as our kidneys. Every single they filter pollutants, they stop erosion, right? They stop flooding, right? Through the unique bacteria and plants and soil type, and but over the course, sorry, but over the course of the last several years, almost I think what 90% of 90% I think of our wetlands are disappearing. And the reason why and most importantly, right, is that okay, yep, there you go. Two-thirds, I'm sorry, of our wetlands are disappearing. And the reason why they're so important is because, they, as you can see here, are act as a system, as this, hmm, they help connect these different bodies of water, right? They act as a filter. So before this stuff ends up into our creeks and our rivers and our waterways, right? They filter all this stuff out, and act as essentially as a giant sponge. And they're able to do that, right? Because of the tannic water. So tannic water is essentially this tea-colored water that exists, right? It's essentially caused by rotting wood. So wood has something called tannins in it, which are essentially kind of these organic compounds that, these organic bitter compounds that, you know, um, kind of leach out into the water. Well, when people see water like this, sometimes people think the water is dirty. It's not. I mean, this is sometimes you want this type of water. You don't want the water to always be clean because when you have this tannic water in it, what it essentially does is that it stops algal growth from happening. Because like I mentioned earlier, right? Some plants need three things: sunlight, nutrients, and water. Well, again, there's plenty of water. Well, the two limiting factors are sunlight. So when you are able to limit the amount of sunlight to occur, algae is a plant, you're essentially suppressing the algae's ability to grow, even though it has those nutrients available. And it acts again like as this kind of as this sponge throughout the entire state, and we've completely lost most of it. And the thing about the implications of that, that means every single body of water across this entire area isn't getting filtered anymore. Our lake systems are naturally Florida has one of the largest concentrations of of lakes in the entire world. And our lake systems have over evolution over time have been adapted to connect to these wetlands. They've adapted to getting these tannic waters into them, and as a result, because this tea-colored water isn't coming into it, you have these huge algae blooms. You have this destruction that occurs because nature isn't allowed to do what it does best. Nature seeks balance. And then so we have our Central Florida wetlands, and now we also have our Central Florida forest. So this is so the connection between forest and our water supply is fascinating, right? So this is an example of something called pine savanna, right? If you look around Gainesville, you see plenty of it, right? Pine savanna is essentially an ecosystem dominated by pine trees, right? That has a low degree of shrubby bushes, right, like salt palmettos and different kind of low-lying plants. Well, there's not really too much ground cover here as opposed to something like an oak forest, right? It's a lot darker. There's a lot more shade. There's a lot more stuff there's a lot more leaflet on the ground. Well, what happens is that when it rains, you know, because oak trees are able to sprout out a lot more, and because their leaf shapes are a lot larger, right? When rain comes from the sky, these leaves essentially stop the water, catch a lot of the water that hit the ground, reducing the amount of water that goes back into the aquifer. So the water comes from the sky, hits the ground, and leaches back into the aquifer, right? And that's what recharges it. Well, I mean, if you take that and you compare it to something like a pine savanna, right, which doesn't have as much leaf litter, whose whose trees aren't sprawled out as much and whose are a lot smaller, like this, well, a lot more water is able to reach the ground. A lot more water is able to refill our aquifers. And I mean, the difference between an oak forest and a pine savanna gets 30% more water recharge in those areas as opposed to an oak forest. You know, oak not all forests are equal, not all habitats are equal. So when we hear solutions, so when we talk about solutions like land remediation, right? When companies come in and want to develop a piece of land and they say, we'll develop this piece of land, but we'll plant a bunch of trees somewhere else. Well, that's not an effective way of dealing with these solutions because what happens is because not all habitats are equal, like I'm showing you guys, right? An oak forest is radically different than the pine savanna. The species are different. The effects on the hydrology are different. The effects on human well-being are different, and so understanding these nuances allows us to make more effective solutions and understand what exactly needs to be done, to do this. 90% of the entire southeast was longleaf pine savanna. Right now in Florida, only 2% of pine savanna remains. The Florida scrub jay, which is the only bird endemic to Florida, meaning that it can be found nowhere else in the world. Right, our state bird is the pelican for some reason, but the only bird that can be found nowhere else in the world, the Florida scrub jay, is a habitat of pine savanna. And again, we're getting rid of this, because because we're not giving enough credit to how interconnected these systems are. Right, as we keep on seeing, land affects water, water affects land. So down through, so going, so down through the wetlands and forests in Central Florida, hitting the Everglades. The Everglades is one of the most biodiverse systems in North America. It acts as essentially a huge, just as the Amazon, in South America acts as a huge, kind of acts as a lung to the world. The Everglades acts as a huge filter for Florida. All the water so the Everglades is roughly right here, right? Here's the water in Everglades. All the water that comes through here ends up in our Everglades. And here's a map of that. So when you're stopping the natural flow of water, when you're getting rid of these wetlands, when you're getting rid of these forests, you're completely disrupting that natural flow that exists and that has existed for millions of for millions of years, which is completely disrupting the biology in these communities because of the disruption because of the disruption of flow, right? You have a lot less you're reducing the amount of fresh water that occurs, right? Which means there's a lot less fresh water hitting Florida Bay. Well, that's affecting salinity levels, right? The amount of salt in this water is going up because it needs fresh water. Well, there's less, and not because there is and then because there is less fresh water, right, the salt levels are going up, which is affecting the type of plants and animals that live there, right? Plants and animals that live in these estuarine environments, right, that are used to fresh water, like mullet, like sheep's head, like some of our like striped bass, right, a lot of these kind of big prize game species fish aren't able to survive as well because we're reducing the flow of fresh water. And not to mention, right, because we've completely changed the flow of water and we've dug these humongous canals from Lake Okeechobee. You have the Caloosahatchee, I think here in the St. Lucie here, um, and what happens that instead of all this water getting naturally filtered out through these hundreds of miles of wetlands, we're essentially sending all this effluent, all these pollutants, all these pesticides directly into the coast on either side. And what's happening, right? Our current system is taking all this effluent, all this nasty stuff, and shooting it up the west coast, up the east coast, and now we're wondering why things like the Indian River Lagoon, which are up here, or why places like St. Petersburg are having these historic red tides. I'm not sure, and I'm not saying that every single red tide is directly the result of this effluent discharge, but I'm also saying there's a connection, right? These currents are taking everything that's in this water up the entire coast, and that's affecting us. People that are hundreds of miles away. And not and also, through the destruction of our Everglades, right? It's also cultural erosion. The Seminole people, are not able to hunt or fish or conduct their indigenous practices because of the stuff we're putting into our waterways. There's some incredibly scary stuff. We're putting lead, we're putting mercury. Mercury levels are through the roof. Um, because of the industrial practices we're doing, because of the agricultural discharge, because of the factory waste that we're putting in, and that's having and that's having and because there's mercury and because there's mercury in these systems, right? That are the Seminoles couldn't fish. There's mercury in our fish, right? This mercury goes up the food chain, and so when a Seminole person or when me and you go fishing and we eat those fish, we get mercury biting that stuff. And here's Kevin Kneff talking about how that's affecting the tribe.
And the needs of the tribe in terms of Everglades restoration are not at all exclusive to the overall goals and needs and objectives of Everglades restoration that would serve the entirety of Florida citizens who depend on the Glades to be able to live here in South Florida. For you all up in the Gainesville area, where you still think that you are maybe removed from the Everglades, in fact, you are not. The water underneath this ground is a river of water that moves all throughout the state, moves north, moves south, based on head differences of water on the land. And that is very much affected by the water that ultimately is here on the southern part of the peninsula. So our future of being able to have Florida, in particular South Florida, continue to be a place for people to live is directly dependent upon whether or not Everglades restoration, in the way that it can be, is going to be successful.
And here's some example of some of this influence, right? So this is, I think, a sugar processing facility, right? All this mercury gets mercury is able comes into Florida waterways through something known as atmospheric deposition. That's just a really fancy way of just saying that mercury goes up into the sky and then comes down through things like rain. And again, that ends up in our waterways, and that completely changes and affects us, right? Again, I can't hunt our fish. I can't hunt our fish because the mercury in our fish would hurt me. And this is the type of resource that we're destroying. The Everglades again is just this incredibly beautiful system. It's the only place in the world where things like crocodiles or alligators can coexist together. It has this wonderful array of birds, and there's cougars and there's bears, and there's this incredibly diverse hotspot of life. Again, one of the most biodiverse places in America. And we're destroying it. Not in a matter, not a matter of decades, but in a matter of years, because of the directly actions we're having. And after the Everglades, right? Florida water, the journey of Florida's water ends in the Keys. The Keys is the third largest coral reef on the planet, and 90% of it is gone. Think about that for a second. The third largest coral reef on the planet, and 90% of the coral reef is gone. Why aren't we talking about this more? We have, and this is happening over the course of a matter of years, right? In 3 years, you have a beautiful system like pillar coral I'm sorry, this is all pillar coral, and in 3 years, this coral reefs are getting obliterated. Most people in Florida don't even realize that that we have a coral reef. It's the largest coral reef in the continental United States, and again, the third largest in the world, and it's getting destroyed in years. And we're not having, this isn't the front of our headlines. We're talking about all this other ridiculous stuff, and we're not talking about the destruction of the coral reef. Like the Great Barrier Reef, when it gets, it always makes headlines when we talk about its destruction. But the third largest coral reef that's on our doorstep isn't getting talked about. I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous. And it's just home to this wonderful vast array of beautiful corals and of dolphins and of sea turtles and of sharks. It acts as a nursery for all types of corals and all types of fish. Coral reefs act as storm breakers. So when we have these humongously, when you have these hurricanes hitting the Keys, right? Well, coral reefs act as a storm break. So when hurricanes, waves smack go smack into our shoreline, right? Well, corals are our first defense. We're spending millions of dollars on climate change relief, right? But we're not, focusing enough on our reefs. I mean, nature provides us the ability. Nature provides the ability, towards problems. And instead of spending millions of dollars trying to recreate what nature does, we can just allow nature to work for free. But by just helping it and giving it the credit it deserves. And I keep on mentioning these current systems, right? Well, our current systems exist all across Florida, right? We have things like the loop current, right, exist in the middle of the Gulf. It bleeds into the Florida current, which is right here, and then shoots. I'm sorry, the Florida current's here, and then shoots up and then shoots up the coast into the Gulf Stream. Whatever exists here, whatever pollutants, whatever effluent, whatever discharge, right, that comes off from our Everglades, that comes off Florida Bay, goes into these straits and gets shot up the coast. And not only does it affect Florida, right, but because it affects but because it goes into the Gulf Stream, right, it's affecting it's affecting places like Georgia and North Carolina, things as far as New York, right? And this map does a really good job of showing the international implications that we're talking about too. What we do on the coast of Florida is affecting our partners in Mexico. It's affecting places like Cuba or Jamaica or or the Caribbean islands. Nature doesn't have borders. We so, y- and this is going to be
This
kind of
place used to be prettier than it is. And, when I hear the stories of these old timers talk about what it looked like, in the 80s even, which was not that long before I started diving here, it just makes me really sad I didn't get to see that. So yeah, I think for me, like, how can I make it so other people don't feel that way?
So that was Dr. Karen Neely. She was a coral scientist in the Florida Keys, right? And we think, and we think of science, right? We think of, this kind of just this objective, kind of linear, kind of way of viewing the world. Well, I mean, she's crying as she's talking about this because this is the effect it's having on people, right? We have this magnificent, entity of nature, that's getting destroyed, right? This is a picture from the 80s, the 70s, I'm sorry, the 80s, the 70s, 2004, and 2014, right? In 40 years, our coral reef went from this magnificent phenomenon of nature to something like a bomb went off. That's what we're doing, right? That's what every single act, and that's why what we do, and that's why every single action that we do matters. Because every single time we put fertilizer on a lawn when we're not supposed to, every single time we, drink a bottle, every single time we throw a piece of trash out on the ground, every single time we don't advocate or we don't use our voice, to push politicians or to push our representatives to do better, to act better. This is where we're losing. And again, this isn't this is what happening within our lifetime. I mean, and, most of us, if not all of us, were alive when this existed. And now, right, this is from 2014. I mean, at 10 years, right? And this is what's happening. So what do we do? How do we how do we solve these these issues? We do that through the solutions to this aren't simple, aren't complicated. In fact, they're radically simple. Things like communication, talking to each other, having conversations like the ones we're having now, right? Just are going to change things because because when you plant a seed, because when you plant a seed in somebody's mind, right, that seed might not always grow right away, right, but it might inspire someone to act differently through through your own example. When you go around and you pick up a piece of trash, right, someone might notice. I mean, and they might not pick up a piece of trash the second, third, or fourth, or fifth time, but they might pick it up the sixth time, right? Being our example, communicating, using our voice, you know pushing our elected officials, all this everything I've been telling you about, right? All this water stuff is managed by something called the Florida Water Management Districts, right? I call them the most important agency you've never heard about. These districts control and manage water in Florida, and they're unelected positions. They're appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate, right? And these districts are run by boards. But instead of having scientists, or instead of having educators, or instead of having environmental advocates in these boards, you're having developers and agricultural interests and people that frankly shouldn't have any business, dominating a board. You should have scientists. You should have educators. You should have people that to have a different stake other than development on these boards. But because they're not elected, right, they're appointed, right, they're able, they're making these decisions with our consent. But the wonderful thing about these boards is that they do in fact take public comment, right? Agencies like this need more because they aren't elected, right? Need more oversight by people like us than ever, right? Because it's through our public pressure, it's through our collective action that can force these people to do, to do what's responsible. There's this big debate on, who's really to blame. Is it individual action that's going to solve these issues? Is it, is it a small number of people, right? Is it the farmers? Is the politicians, like who's causing this environmental degradation to happen, right? Who's to blame? Well, I think it's all of us, right? It's like because the minority has always influenced the majority in history, right? That's always, that's been the rule of thumb, right? A small number of people, just like a small number of people can create bad systems, right? A small number of good people can create good systems, right? And through a combination of both keeping the through a combination of both keeping the minority, or the people in power accountable, and through a collective action, right? That's how we can really change things for the better. When you having something as simple as, not fertilizing your lawn during the summer, right? Every time you don't do that, there's less fertilizer and there's less fertilizer that's going into your creek. Something as simple as planting a tree. You stick a mangrove in the ground, it takes 3 seconds, right? That's one more tree that wasn't there before. That's one more mangrove that's stopping erosion, that's stopping sediment from going and hitting our waterways. Creating something called vertical oyster gardens. You take oysters, you attach them on a string, you put them in the water. One oyster can filter out 50 gallons of water a day, right? Putting it out over your dock, right, and allowing it to grow, you're having something that filters out or 500 gallons of water simply by hanging it off your dock. And then again, holding politicians accountable. If you see something you don't like, running for office, for city council, running for mayor, running for state representative, or at the very least supporting people that do. And this is a nonpartisan issue. If you look at these environment issues, topic by topic, they have support of 80, 90, of 80, of 70, 80, or 90%, right? And if you look at the history of water management in Florida, both Republicans and Democrats are advocating for these issues, right? Jeb Bush, a Republican, created the Florida Springs Initiative. Bob Graham, was a huge advocate for the Florida Springs. People like Charlie Crist and everybody, and other, and I mean, name a politician, right? I mean, Ron DeSantis just gave $4.5 billion towards Everglades restoration, right? But if we don't keep, our politicians in our state understand how interconnected our environment is with our interests, whether it's our economic, our political, our cultural, or environmental, you know, interest, they understand that without our environment, Florida is gone. So by pushing people, to do the right thing, right, by being the right example, by inspiring others, by communicating and by talking to people around you, right, that's how we can really implement this change. And with that, I thank you guys for being here, for listening to my talk. If you'd like to contact me, here's my contact information. And if you want to get any clips from the interviews, if you want to look at the interviews I showed you, or check out the interviews I showed you in full, you can scan the QR code. They'll give you the playlist on our YouTube channel to the 60 interviews that I've conducted over the course of this project. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions, but what I'm going to ask is that you repeat the question before you answer it for our Zoom audience so that they will know what we're talking about. Excellent.
Yeah. Which one? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Fertilizing is okay, right? I'm sorry. The question is, should we not fertilize our home gardens? We need fertilizer, right? It helps things to grow, right? But we shouldn't. But we need to be very aware of when we're fertilizing. There's ordinances in place. There's better times, right? When it's rainy season and it rains at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in summer, right? And you fertilize your lawn 12 o'clock. Well, the fertilizer really isn't in. The rain's gonna take it. It's gonna throw it into the creek right next door, right? So I mean, just common sense practices. I mean,
Florida legislature was trying to pass a law on what we got turned to ban.
So that so I mean so if you look at a law like that, I'm sorry. The question was the Florida legislature recently recently attempted to ban communities from passing Florida ordinance from banning ordinances on fertilizer use. Well, I mean, there's an easy way around the law. You know, by simply getting educated. You know, you don't need the city to tell you when to put the fertilizer on your lawn. By keeping up to date, by reading information around you, by talking to people that know, by going to by joining local gardening clubs or etc. You're able to figure that out on your own. So I mean, there might be obstacles along the way, but that's why it requires education. That's why it requires us to share information as widely as possible, right? To get everybody on the same page and to have us act on our own volition instead of getting forced by any one entity.
There are some good news.
Absolutely, and there's quite literally dozens of nonprofits across the entire state that are doing wonderful work, right? I mean, there's probably about a dozen or so in Gainesville. In Tampa Bay alone, for example, I know of something called the Tampa Bay Estuary Program that which plants oyster bed reefs, which plants mangroves, right? I mean, get involved with those organizations. And again, you don't always have to go through government agencies to do something. Go through a nonprofit, go through a university. Obviously do things with people that know what they're doing, right? But get involved and start planting things. Planting one mangrove matters. Planting one vertical oyster garden matters. Planting one batch of seagrass matters. The worst case so the worst case scenario in regard to the environment. So Florida has two different types of issues. It has a water quantity sorry. So the question was, what is the worst case scenario when it comes to the environment in Florida? And when will happen? Um, I don't know when it's gonna happen, but I can assure you that if we don't continue to do what we have to do um more effectively, more efficiently, and if we and again, if we don't keep up the effort on programs that are already working, it's going to happen a lot faster than if we don't put the effort in. Um, Florida has two radically different issues. It has a water quantity problem and it has a water quality problem. So water quantity, right? How much water do we have available? But because of things like climate change, right? The amount of water quantity in Florida is decreasing. Because of something called saltwater intrusion in some areas. Essentially, what that means is that we have this big um we have this we have the aquifer, right? Well, when we pump water out, right? Um, the salt water that's underneath the fresh water gets pushed into gets pushed into into our freshwater, right? So the freshwater becomes contaminated. Well, when you do that, right, there's less freshwater available. So that's a water quantity problem. Also, by overpumping more than but also by overpumping, we're having less water available to us because we're taking out, it's like a chicken cow, right? You're using more than you're putting back in. So that's a water quantity problem. We also have a water quality problem, right? So, how what type of water do we have available to us? Is it clean essentially, right? When we're filling our waterways full of nitrates and for of lead and of mercury, this nasty, horrible stuff, right? Well, the water's a lot dirtier, right? So how can you expect that water to be used, but by any one person, right? So it's like when we address these issues, we have to address these things holistically by tackling both because they bleed into each other. I hope that answers your question. Yep. Yeah. 100 trillion. Yeah. Yep. So the question is, what is the source of mercury pollution in Everglades? So the source of mercury pollution is twofold. First off, it occurs through something called atmospheric deposition. Essentially, mercury gets its way into the atmosphere, right, and then through a chemical process, right, it kind of essentially rains down into our waterways. It gets in the atmosphere through things like factories, right, when we're all those kind of crazy smokestacks you're seeing, those factories are kind of erupting out. Well, that's mercury that has a lot of crazy stuff in it that again gets put down to earth, right? Or what happens is that mercury, so sulfates, which are a product which exist in fertilizers through agriculture use, go into our waterways. Well, there's bacteria in our waterways that through a complex kind of chemical reaction takes those sulfates and converts them into mercury. So it's so there's two different ways, right? And the more agricultural runoff we get into our waterways, right, the more sulfates, right, which increase the mercury levels in these waterways. And what happens is that this mercury, it stays in your cells, right, through something called biomagnification. I'm sorry, through something called bioaccumulation. This mercury goes into your cells, right? Well, when a bigger thing eats a small thing, right? Because the mercury is stuck in its cells, the mercury that the small thing has gets put into the big thing, right? So over the course of time, right, the further you go up the food chain, right, the more this mercury accumulates. So by the time it gets to an apex predator, like let's say me or you, right, or a bear or a puma or an alligator, right, the mercury levels, right, are increasing exponentially as it's going up the ladder. So when someone like me or you eats it, or someone like a bobcat eats it, right, they're essentially eating a bunch of mercury. In fact, there was a case, I think it's 2014, um, that might be the wrong year, but the case certainly exists where a Florida panther died of mercury poisoning because of the bioaccumulation, because of the mercury in the food sources that it's eating. I mean, so it's having a really direct kind of upward, effect on our wildlife. Um, I mean, so okay, so mercury levels have decreased substantially, right, over the course of the last several decades, right, as we've kind of gotten smarter about our agricultural use and kind of and decreasing the amount of runoff, right? But I mean, it certainly still exists. I mean, if you pull up the interview I did with Kevin Kneff, the interview was over an hour long. I mean, his testimony about how mercury affects some of the tribe, I mean, frankly, was scary. I mean, it really was. And again, this is an issue that's affecting all of us because they aren't able to, because of these mercury levels, they aren't able to hunt the illegal fish. We took a, like, I mean, some of the people were destroyed. I mean, obliterated through U.S. imperialism, and now even to this day, we aren't able to give them peace because of the destruction that we're doing, upstream. It's incredibly disheartening. Uh, So you're referring to, so the question was, do you think the work being done to essentially fix the flow of water, in Everglades is going to be an effective solution? Absolutely, right? Anything that reconstructs the natural flow of water from the top of the state to the bottom of the state is going to allow those wetlands, however many are left, right, and through our natural processes to stop, those that influence, those poisons, that erosion, those sediments from getting to Florida Bay, which is going to make Florida Bay healthier, and by nature, the rest of the state healthier. So absolutely. Yep. Every single interview, I mean, I really mean this, was unique in its own way. I mean, whether I was talking to core researchers, okay, sorry, the question was there an interview that I did that was particularly impactful? And I really mean this, that every single interview I did was impactful because it was almost like reading, 60 different books, right? Every single person offered me this radically different perspective that cumulatively helped, really shape the way I looked at these issues. And helped me realize that, like, wow, I mean, a lot of the same issues are popping up over and over and over again, right? We probably should rethink the way we're thinking about these things. And almost every single interview I did discussed interconnectivity of these waterways. Whether I was talking to somebody about the Florida Springs, whether I was talking to someone about the Keys or Tampa or anything else, right? The same motifs come on happening over and over again, right? So I mean, every single one of these interviews was just incredible. So the question was, how are microplastics and deep sea mining affecting the Florida region? So plastic, just like everything else, right, degrades over time. And what happens, right, is that when this plastic degrades into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, right, to the point that, they're getting ingested by bacteria, right, where they're getting ingested by bigger organisms, which again through bioaccumulation, right, through this stuff going up the food chain, is affecting humans. Right, there's been several studies done over the course of the last couple of years. They're actually finding microplastics, right? These incredibly small pieces of plastic in our cells. Right, we're finding plastics at the bottom of the ocean, right, hundreds and hundreds of meters deep. Where no human influence should even exist, right? And these things are pervasive in every single aspect of the world at this point. I mean, there's even talk among some scientists. I mean, the use of plastics in the environment is so profound that it's literally creating a new like sediment layer, right? And so, in our soils because these plastics are getting melted down, they're fusing with other gravel, and and you can literally see the human impact on our soil layers. And then you mentioned deep sea mining. Deep sea mining is a new prosperous kind of is a new way of mining that we're discovering. Essentially, at the bottom of the ocean, right? There's an incredible amount of cobalt, of magnesium, of all these kind of lithium, of all these kind of crazy metals that we need for things like our phones and computers, right? Well, deep sea mining is kind of a novel way of kind of getting access to those minerals, and in some ways, right, it is more effective, right, because there's not as much human cost, right? You don't have child slavery, right, in the middle of a rig in the middle of the ocean, right? It's a very technical profession, but what's happening is that we're going to these parts of the ocean that we have no idea about, that we don't that full of hundreds of species that are new to science, and we're essentially destroying up we're mining, right, which is causing all this dust to exist in the water column, which is affecting the plants and animals in this area, and we're affecting a part of the world that we don't really understand. And I'm not sure that's completely wise, right? It's like but I mean, again, if we want things like solar panels and electric cars, I mean, there's not really any great solution to that. I mean, So, I mean, I'm not sure about deep sea mining. I mean, I'm really not. The thing about most environmental issues is that there's no net zero, right? There's no, every piece of trash we throw out there exists. There's not gonna be a perfect solution to anything, right? Which is why the best solutions to environmental issues tend to be solutions that work with the natural flow of water. Or I'm sorry, with the natural flow of the environment, right? Don't stop with don't, work there's nothing wrong with development, and I'm not, there's nothing wrong with building a house, or there's nothing wrong with having a TV, or, going along with everyday lives, right? But there is a problem when you're stopping nature from doing what it normally does. Work within nature's confines, right? Go with the flow of nature. Don't act as a wall, because eventually the wall's going to break, and that's when we run into our lover issues. Sure. So, I mean, so absolutely right. So there's different. So the cost of water is different. Um, I'm sorry. So um, the question was address the cost of or the economics of water, right? So is it more expensive to essentially filter our water, or is it more expensive to just keep the water clean in the first place? And the answer is always going to be to keep the water clean in the first place, right? Because again, when you stop nature from doing what it does best, right? Nature does all these beautiful services for free. It stops climate change from happening. It stops erosion from happening. It keeps our water clean, right? I mean, nature for 4.5 billion years, however old the planet is, right, does these wonderful things for free, and so when we don't do these things, right, of course it's going to have an economic effect. I, I'm gonna, f- br- I'm gonna misremember the numbers, right, but things like desalination, right, are exponentially more expensive than getting fresh water from the springs, right? So if we destroy our river systems or our spring systems, and we just rely on things like desalination, right, that's gonna push the buck forward, and it's gonna cost us exponentially more to do something that nature can do for free. So there absolutely is. I'm very happy for that question. The question was, is there going to be an online exhibit as part of this research? There absolutely is. It's going to debut sometime next week, either Monday, Tuesday, something like that. It's called Interwoven Waters: Exploring Florida's Interconnected Waterways. It's essentially a lot of what I showed you today, but a lot more in depth. There's a lot more clips of the different people I talked to. It breaks down kind of each and every single issue I discussed a lot more kind of eloquently than I think I did. And it's virtual, so anybody anywhere in the world with the link can have access to it. So the question was, am I aware of any legislation that pushes for the use of native plants and decreases the emphasis on lawns? Um, I'm not personally aware of any direct legislation, though I am aware of ordinances, at least within my own city, that push for native plants. Right. So, for example, the city of Treasure Island, where I'm from, right, they really push to have um, Florida-friendly or Florida native plants. In our area, I mean, in my spare time, I do a lot of invasive species cleanups of the city and things of that nature. So I think that's a city by city, unless there's been a directive by Tallahassee, and that tends to be a city by city initiative. But again, I mean, not having Bermuda grass, not having St. Augustine's grass is so much better for the environment. I mean, you're saving water. Let me put things in perspective for you. A quarter of the entire water usage in the entire state, 25% of the water we use in the state goes to watering our lawns. Our lawns, which do not provide an ecological, a te- you know, an ecological, an edible, or any otherwise, or anything otherwise other than the aesthetic benefit to us, we're spending a quarter of our total water usage on that. St. Augustine's grass and Bermuda's grass is ecological genocide as far as I'm concerned. Instead of having this wonderful array of species, of insects, of wildflowers, of beauty that exists in your lawn, you're promoting this, a monocrop that again serves virtually zero purpose. I mean, it's like, you know, the the lawn thing kind of the long thing isn't really accepted by everybody, but I think it's truly something that if we show people the benefit of, they're not gonna think twice about it. It just makes sense in every way. So the question was, am I aware of any studies affecting kind of local water supply? There's a mention of a slaughterhouse occurring in Newberry and of Jenny Springs kind of affecting the water quantity in local springs. I'm not aware of any specific I wasn't aware of the slaughterhouse in Newberry, but I do know that, there are preliminary studies that are showing that when you pump, so all these springs like I showed you are pretty close to each other, right? Relatively speaking, right? And when you overpump one spring, right, well, that's going to decrease the amount of water locally in the area, which is going to decrease the amount of pressure available to those other springs and cause less water to, and cause lost water to exist. Like I showed you with that one map, on the Florida aquifer, right? You have these, it's just a bunch of channels, right? And this kind of labyrinth of water that exists underneath our feet. I mean, it's nothing more complicated than that. So when you're sucking up all the water from one area, right, or when you're not doing something, or when you're decreasing the amount of water that's leaching into the water, into the soil, in the areas next door, the idea that's going to have a butterfly effect, I mean, to me is logical. Again, I'm not a scientist, right? But I'm sure that their studies are looking at things of that nature. I've seen the data. So the question was, have I seen data regarding how much fertilizer is used by agriculture as opposed to things like our lawns? Um, I've seen the data. I can envision it in my mind right now, but I don't want to give you a wrong number. But a lot of this information is very publicly available at the water management at the water management districts. And you bring a good point. And I don't mean to only talk lawn use, right? Agriculture uses incredible amount of fertilizer. But we're not going to stop a huge farm from producing food, right? What we can do though is that we can have a direct effect on our own houses, on our own lifestyles by reducing the amount of alcohol fertilizer that we're using. Because every single one of those, because if there's 100 people in this room, right, and 100 people who don't reduce the amount of fertilizer on their lawns, well, that's a quantifiable amount. That's a quantifiable amount that we're helping the environment. And that's something that we individually can deal with. That's why I'm picking on it so much. But you definitely raise a good point. So the way I see it, there's kind of almost three different stages, right? There's, somebody that's going, there's somebody that's going to be aware of the solution, right? And not necessarily, go out of their way to run a campaign or anything else, right? But they're going to be aware of it, right? And that might, at the very least, start a conversation with somebody, right? That to me is useful, right? If you know about something and you talk about it, right? Well, that spreads a seed, right? And if you talk, and if one person talks to 10 different people, maybe nine of those people might not adopt the practice, but that one person might, right? So you're having a 10% return on that conversation, right? So that's the first stage, right? Then you have the second stage, right? People that are knowledgeable, right? That start doing that, that at least start volunteering for like for some amount of given time, right? So whether they're, volunteering at their local, environmental organization, whether they give money to someone, right? Whether kind of these more passive, but sometimes in some ways more direct ways of addressing these issues, like, like, they're actively working to solve the problem, right? They're not as passive as the first stage, but they're not necessarily, running the revolution either, right? Then you have the third stage, right? People that are actively and systematically trying to figure out these issues, right? A lot of the people that are running, a lot of the people that are part of, things like the Santa Fe River Alliance, or a lot of the people that, a lot of the kind of these major advocates, like Robert Knight, right? The people that are, they're running for office or writing op-eds or, are doing research or, and then are a lot more involved in their community, right? You need people of all types, right? You can't expect every single person to be an advocate or to have enough time. Life's complicated. Life's hard enough as it is. You can't fault somebody for not, being the best advocate on the planet, but you can, at least encourage people to know about these issues, right? To know basic facts like Florida has the third largest coral reef on the planet, or to know what the aquifer is, right? Those pieces of information help them because when they vote or when they hear politicians speak about these things, right, they can at least, be aware of, of what makes sense and what doesn't. So there's just different ways to help out, and I don't blame anybody for whatever way they choose. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, yeah, no worries. So the question was how are oral history interviews impacting the way I look at the environment. I mean, so the exhibit I'm gonna have at the meeting soon is dedicated to my father. I'm sorry, my grandfather, Vasilios Kosmakos. He was a fisherman from Greece, right? And I learned everything about the environment I could from my grandfather. He taught me how to fish. He taught me how important the waterways are. He taught me to garden. He was the one that allowed me to establish my connections to land, right? And most importantly, he taught me that wisdom, right, and knowledge can come from a lot of different sources, and that no one should be discounted. Not the child, not the child on the street, not the person with the PhD, not the businessman, not the farmer, not anybody else, because every single person in this world has something to contribute, right? At the very least, right, knowing what they don't know, right, allows us as academics to make more effective solutions. The worst thing that we do as academics is put ourselves in this ivory tower, right, and not create solutions and not have conversations that are able to be understood by the average person. You know, we monopolize information, we hoard it, and instead of working with the public, instead of doing public programs, instead of putting more of our energy into helping the public understand these issues, right, we tend to just live in our bubble, and we don't help the public like we're supposed to, right? By ignoring the information of the fishermen and all these other people I mentioned, right, you're ignoring a vast amount of information. A lot of the information I mean, in our studies show this. A lot of the information that that takes academics decades to learn, right? Our indigenous peoples, or our fishermen, or our hunters, or a lot of the people in our society have originally understood this. And you could get this information by simply having a conversation, right? We can't be biased. We can't be ignorant, right? Just because and we can't discriminate based on degrees or things like that. Knowledge is universal. Oh, thank you. Oh, right.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You're my hand. It's very encouraging when we have young people doing this work. I appreciate the work you're doing. But he's been holding out on me. I didn't know his nickname was Billy until I saw your slide. So much easier than Vasilios. And I'm interested in what Vasilios the philosopher is about too. So, but thank you for all for coming. And remember, John Moran not only took pictures you used, these are all his pictures around the room in the Great Southern Music Hall exhibit. And his corner is right over there. Before you leave, take a little time to look at this exhibit and the brand new one that just went up about the people with different languages and backgrounds who are in the Alachua County area. It's called We Are Here. The opening reception for that is next Friday night I hope that you will join the museum, see Willett back there, come back again if you like what you hear at the museum. We're here for the community. Thank you.